Workers of the world, listen closely, for what I am about to tell you overturns everything society has trained you to believe. You have been taught that history is carved by the brilliance of great men, by rulers, by capitalists, by those whose names are etched upon monuments. But this is the grandest deception of all. History is not made by the few who command, but by the many who labor. It is not the hand that signs the decree, but the hands that build the world that shape humanity's destiny. And if you doubt your power, it is only because the system has spent centuries convincing you to forget it. Look around you. Every factory, every railway line, every field of harvest, every machine, every city that stretches toward the horizon, none of it came from the minds of those who sit in high offices counting their profits. It was carved out of the earth by you. It was assembled by you. It stands because of you. Capital has never created anything by itself. It merely appropriates what labor produces. As I wrote, labor is the source of all wealth, and yet the laborer remains dispossessed of that very wealth. This contradiction is not accidental, it is the mechanical heartbeat of capitalism. Under this system, the worker is told he is free, yet he sells his life hour by hour to survive. He is told he is equal, yet the fruits of his labor are seized by those who have never touched the machines he operates. He is told society is democratic, yet the true power lies not in the ballot box but in the ownership of production. Whoever controls the means of production controls the meaning of freedom. And today, those means lie in the hands of a class whose interests are fundamentally opposed to yours. Capitalism survives only by transforming human beings into instruments. It thrives on your exhaustion, your alienation, your fear that without your employer you cannot live. But understand this, it is not the capitalist who gives you a livelihood, it is you who give life to the capitalist. Without your labor, their wealth collapses into dust. Without your cooperation, their empires become empty shells. Without your consent, their authority dissolves. And here lies the truth they fear most. The working class is the only truly revolutionary force in history because it has nothing to preserve but everything to win. Every ruling class before has built societies that served its own interests. Kings defended royal blood. Feudal lords defended land. Capitalists defend profit. But the worker, the producer of the world, can build a society that serves humanity itself. This is why the class struggle is not a theory but an inevitability. You do not enter it by choice. You are born into it. For as long as the wealth you create belongs to someone else, as long as your labor enriches those who do not labor, as long as your lives are governed by the impersonal forces of the market rather than your own collective will, the struggle continues. And the moment you recognize this not as an unfortunate circumstance, but as a historical law, you begin to awaken to your role as the authors of the future. But power does not emerge from awakening alone. It emerges from organization. The capitalists are united by profit. The workers must be united by purpose. Solidarity is not a slogan, it is the mechanism by which the working class transforms from scattered individuals into a conscious force. When workers understand that an injury to one is an injury to all, they become ungovernable. When they recognize that their liberation is bound together, no power on earth can halt their movement. Let no one tell you that the existing order is eternal. As I demonstrated throughout my work, every mode of production carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. Capitalism, too, builds the conditions for its supersession. Vast productive capacities that no longer require exploitation, global interconnectedness that binds humanity, and a proletariat that grows not only in numbers, but in awareness. The very contradictions of the system sharpen its own downfall. And so I tell you today, you are not merely participants in history, you are its makers. You are not the background of society, you are its foundation. You are not voiceless, you have simply been denied the means to speak. But once the workers of the world discover that they are the driving force of every economic, political, and social transformation, they cease to ask permission from the old world and begin to construct the new. The future does not belong to those who own capital. It belongs to those who produce it. It belongs to those whose hands build the world, whose minds imagine its possibilities, whose unity can reshape its destiny. History has never been written by the privileged, it is written by the struggles of ordinary people who become extraordinary through collective purpose. Workers, rise into your role as the authors of tomorrow. Recognize your power, understand your unity, and act with the certainty that the world you long for is not only necessary, it is possible, and it can be made only by you. History is shaped by the labor of the working class, not the elite, because every structure of society, every economic transformation, and every leap in human development has been built upon the backs, hands, and collective effort of those who toil. The ruling classes throughout history have claimed authorship of civilization, yet they have produced nothing without first extracting the life, time, and energy of the worker. From ancient empires to modern industries, the monuments of progress attributed to kings, emperors, and capitalists were in truth created by the millions whose names never entered the official record. The elite write history books, but the workers shape the material conditions that make history possible. This fundamental contradiction between who creates the world and who claims ownership over it defines the deep structure of society. In every epoch, the ruling class has masked the contribution of labor behind the glamour of authority, wealth, or military power. Pharaohs were praised for their pyramids, though they never carried a single stone. Feudal lords boasted of vast estates, though it was the serfs who ploughed, sowed, and reaped. Today, capitalists celebrate innovation and growth, though they rely entirely on the workers who make their factories run, their services function, and their profits multiply. The elite have always been the face of history, yet never its engine. The productive forces that move society forward are created only when the laboring masses transform raw materials into something greater than nature had provided. Without this transformation, without this human imprint on the world, history cannot advance. But the working class does more than produce goods. It produces the very social relations in which people live. When workers gather in factories, fields, and offices, they develop forms of cooperation, shared struggle, and collective knowledge that the ruling class cannot replicate. Capitalist production relies on the coordination and discipline of labor, but this coordination also reveals to workers their own united strength. Through daily interactions, shared experiences of exploitation, and common aspirations, workers come to understand both their oppression and their potential. The ruling class may impose hierarchy, but the workers generate solidarity. They are compelled to organize, to communicate, and to adapt in ways the elite depend on yet fear, for these bonds contain the seeds of resistance. The elite portray themselves as the guardians of progress because they control institutions, laws, and narratives. They possess the means to distribute information, establish norms, and reinforce ideology. They write the textbooks, fund the media, and influence the political sphere, ensuring that the story of history reflects their interests. The worker appears in these accounts only as a background figure, anonymous and interchangeable. Yet the actual movement of history, economic change, technological development, shifts in social order emerges not from the intentions of the ruling class, but from contradictions within the productive system. Contradictions generated by the relationship between labor and capital. Workers are the ones who confront and endure these contradictions, and through their struggles, they force society to evolve. The working class has always been the force that disrupts stagnation. When their conditions become intolerable, when exploitation sharpens to unbearable levels, they rise in collective movements that reshape the world. Every major transformation, revolutions, democratic expansions, labor rights, welfare reforms has been achieved not by the generosity of the elite, but by the pressure exerted by workers refusing to accept injustice. Even when concessions are granted from above, they are granted only because workers mobilize from below. It is this constant pressure, this ongoing class struggle, that drives history forward. The labor of the working class is also the source of society's potential future. As technological innovations develop, many imagine that machines or automated systems will reduce the significance of the worker. But machines do not create value, they merely amplify the labor embedded within them. Every invention originates from human intellect, and every product of machinery still requires human labor in design, maintenance, oversight, and distribution. Capital may attempt to reduce the worker's role, But it cannot eliminate the fundamental principle that labor is the measure of value and the foundation of production. As long as society depends on material goods and services, it depends on the working class. When the workers recognize their role in shaping history, they begin to understand their power. They realize that the elite are not the masters of fate but custodians of systems built by others. The worker sees that the wealth accumulated by the ruling class is simply accumulated labor, extracted and concentrated. This recognition is the awakening of class consciousness, the moment when individuals understand their collective position in society. Once this consciousness spreads, once workers grasp that they are the architects of history, they can assert their right to determine its direction, transforming the world according to their own needs and aspirations. Capitalism enriches the few by exploiting the many because it is a system built on the extraction of surplus value from the laboring majority, a structure in which the worker produces far more than they are ever compensated for, while the capitalist claims ownership over the entire product of that labor. This relationship is not an accidental injustice or the result of individual greed. It is the core mechanism by which capitalism operates. The worker sells their labor power because they have no other means to survive, while the capitalist purchases that labor power in order to convert it into profit. In this exchange, the appearance of equality masks a deep inequality. The worker receives wages that barely reflect a fraction of the value they create, and the remainder, the surplus, is appropriated by the owner of capital. It is this surplus that becomes the source of wealth, accumulation, and power for the ruling class. Every profit recorded in capitalist society represents unpaid labor. The fortunes of industrialists, the dividends collected by shareholders, the expansion of corporations, all are built on the difference between what the worker produces and what the worker is paid. This exploitation is hidden beneath contracts, wages, and the illusion of free choice, but it remains exploitation nonetheless. The system claims to reward merit and innovation, yet the true engine of economic life is the collective, coordinated labor of millions whose contribution is systematically undervalued. The ruling class benefits not because they work harder or possess superior character, but because they own the means by which others must work in order to live. Capitalism perpetuates exploitation by creating a labor market where workers are compelled to compete with one another for survival. This competition fragments solidarity and forces individuals to accept conditions that degrade their dignity and well-being. The fear of unemployment becomes a tool of discipline. The capitalist does not need to threaten the worker. The system itself exerts pressure through the scarcity of stable employment and the constant possibility of economic insecurity. This insecurity is not accidental but essential, for a worker who is desperate is a worker who cannot resist. In this way, the many are kept subordinate so that the few may continue to extract value without interruption. The enrichment of the few is also reinforced by the ownership of property and capital. Those who control factories, technology, land, and financial institutions possess the power to dictate economic terms. They determine wages, working hours, and the pace of production. They decide which industries rise and which collapse. The worker, having no ownership over the tools they operate, is dependent on the capitalist for access to the means of survival. This dependency creates a power imbalance so vast that it becomes invisible, normalized as the natural order of the world. Yet at its core lies a simple truth. A small minority gains wealth not through their own labor, but through the appropriation of the labor of the majority. The ideology of capitalism insists that enrichment at the top will eventually benefit everyone through growth and opportunity. But this promise is perpetually deferred. Instead, as capital accumulates in fewer hands, inequality deepens. Wealth becomes concentrated, and with wealth comes the ability to influence political institutions, shape laws, and control narratives. The capitalist class extends its power beyond the economy into the realm of governance and culture. They frame their interests as universal interests, presenting their accumulation as progress and their dominance as efficiency. Meanwhile, those who produce the wealth of society struggle with rising costs of living, precarious employment, and diminishing access to fundamental necessities. Exploitation under capitalism also manifests in the alienation of the worker from the product of their labor, from the labor process, from other human beings, and from their own potential. The worker does not see themselves reflected in the goods they create. They do not control the rhythm of their work or the use of their abilities. Their labor becomes a commodity to be bought and sold, stripping it of its human essence. This alienation ensures that the enrichment of the few is accompanied by the impoverishment not merely materially but spiritually of the many. The system requires the worker to surrender their creativity, time, and identity in exchange for wages that never equal the value they generate. The capitalist class defends its enrichment by presenting exploitation as efficiency, normalizing the idea that profit is the natural outcome of enterprise rather than the outcome of unpaid labor. They point to markets, competition, and innovation as justification for their position. Yet the truth remains unchanged. Capital cannot multiply itself without first consuming human labor. Every towering profit margin is rooted in the extraction of value from people whose lives are rendered secondary to production targets and profit goals. Capitalism enriches the few by exploiting the many because its survival depends on this imbalance. The wealth of the ruling class grows only by ensuring that the work of the majority remains undervalued, underpaid, and unrecognized. This dynamic continues as long as the many remain unaware of the source of their oppression, for the system thrives on invisibility. But once workers see that their labor is the foundation of all wealth, they begin to understand the true nature of exploitation and the power they hold to transform the world. Workers possess the real power because they create all wealth, not as a metaphor or symbolic truth, but as a material reality grounded in the very structure of economic life. Every object that sustains society, every tool that advances production, every service that allows daily existence to function is the result of human labor. No amount of capital, property, or managerial authority can generate value by itself. Machines must be operated, maintained, and designed. Resources must be extracted and transformed. Systems must be coordinated by human effort. Without workers, the entire edifice of the economy collapses. This foundational fact reveals that power does not truly rest with those who own, but with those who produce, for the creation of wealth originates not in boardrooms, but in the collective labor of millions. The capitalist class attempts to conceal this truth behind the illusion that capital itself is productive, as if investment or ownership alone conjures value. But capital is nothing more than accumulated labor, the stored result of previous human activity. A factory, a piece of machinery, or a financial asset reflects labor already performed. When these things generate profit, they do so only because living labor is applied to them. The worker's role is not supplementary, it is indispensable. Every profit margin, dividend, and accumulation of wealth depends entirely on the capacity of labor to produce more value than it receives in wages. This surplus value, the difference between what the worker creates and what the worker is paid, is the source of capitalist wealth, and it exists only because workers generate it. Workers possess real power because they collectively drive the entire system forward. Their cooperation, coordination, and shared routines form the invisible framework enabling society to function. No capitalist can single-handedly operate a factory, transport goods, maintain infrastructure, provide services, or sustain the networks of production and distribution. The elite are a minority whose power rests entirely on the continued activity of the majority. The moment workers withdraw their labor, the system grinds to a halt. The flow of goods stops, profits evaporate, and the ruling class loses the material basis of its authority. This potential to stop the world by ceasing to work is not merely symbolic. It reflects a structural power embedded in the nature of production itself. Yet, workers often remain unaware of this power because the system conditions them to see themselves as dependent. They are taught that without employers they have no livelihood, that their survival hinges on the goodwill of those who control capital. But the truth is inverted. It is not the worker who depends on the capitalist. It is the capitalist who depends on the worker. Without labor, capital cannot grow, industries cannot function, and wealth cannot accumulate. The seeming dominance of the ruling class is sustained not by their strength but by the workers' unawareness of their own. The ideology of capitalism masks exploitation by presenting the laborer as interchangeable and the owner as indispensable, when in reality it is the worker who carries the system on their shoulders. The real power of workers is also revealed through the social character of labor. Production under capitalism requires collective effort. Teams of workers in factories, networks of service providers, logistical systems connecting global markets. This collective nature of labor creates a shared experience of exploitation and a shared interest in liberation. When workers recognize that their struggles are not individual misfortunes, but expressions of a broader social contradiction, they begin to see themselves as a class with common interests. This recognition, class consciousness, awakens the political dimension of workers' power. It transforms isolated individuals into a unified force capable of demanding rights, reshaping institutions, and challenging the ownership of production. Historical transformations confirm this power. Every major advance for humanity, shorter working days, safety regulations, collective bargaining, civil rights, social protections, was not a gift from the elite, but a victory wrested from them by organized labor. The ruling class concedes only when workers exert enough pressure that maintaining the status quo becomes untenable. The evolution of society has always moved through the struggles of the working class, asserting their indispensable role. This pattern reveals that workers are not passive participants in history but active shapers of it, capable of altering the direction of social development through collective action. Workers create all wealth, not only materially but socially. They reproduce communities, sustain families, educate future generations, provide care, and maintain the institutions that bind society together. The contributions of labor extend far beyond factories and offices. They encompass the entire spectrum of human cooperation. This broad understanding of labor exposes capitalism's narrow and distorted valuation of human activity. The system recognizes only labor that generates profit, while the real fabric of society is woven by countless acts of daily labor that remain unpaid or unacknowledged. Yet all of this labor is essential, and it reflects the expansive power that workers hold as the creators and sustainers of the world. When workers come to understand that they are the authors of wealth and the backbone of society, they realize that their power is not something to be granted, but something they already possess. What remains is the recognition of this power, the organization to wield it, and the collective will to transform the conditions under which they live. Class consciousness and unity are essential for transformation because only when workers recognize their shared position in society can they act collectively to reshape the conditions that exploit them. As long as workers see themselves merely as isolated individuals competing for survival, they accept the rules of the capitalist system as natural and unchangeable. The ruling class maintains its dominance not simply through wealth, but through the fragmentation of the working class, ensuring that people focus on personal struggles rather than the structural forces that produce those struggles. Class consciousness breaks this illusion by revealing the common roots of oppression, awakening workers to the reality that their hardships are not personal failures, but collective experiences generated by the same economic system. When this understanding spreads, it becomes the foundation for unity, and unity becomes the engine for transformation. Class consciousness emerges when workers understand the true nature of their exploitation. Under capitalism, they sell their labor power because they have no control over the means of production. This dependency forces them into relations where their work enriches others, while they receive only a fraction of the value they create. Yet the system hides this process behind wages, contracts, and the ideology of meritocracy. Workers are encouraged to believe that success depends solely on individual effort, that competition is natural, and that the interests of employers and employees are aligned. Class consciousness dissolves these illusions by revealing the antagonism at the heart of the system. It clarifies that workers, regardless of their occupation or skills, share a common position defined by exploitation, and that their interests stand opposed to those who profit from their labor. Unity arises when this consciousness becomes widespread. Once workers recognize they are members of a class rather than isolated individuals, they begin to understand the power of collective action. The capitalist class is small but unified by its possession of property and its interest in maintaining existing conditions. The working class is large yet weakened by division by job, race, gender, nationality, and countless other categories that capitalism uses to prevent solidarity. Overcoming these divisions requires a deep awareness that the exploitation of one worker is connected to the exploitation of all workers. Unity does not erase differences, it subordinates them to the larger struggle for liberation from exploitation. When workers understand their shared class position, they can build alliances that transcend the boundaries the system imposes. Transformation is impossible without this unity because the structure of capitalism is too deeply rooted to be changed through individual effort or isolated reforms. The system reproduces itself through institutions, ideology, and economic necessity. The ruling class controls political power, media, and the means of production, making it difficult for any single worker or group of workers to challenge its dominance. Only through collective force can the working class counter the concentrated power of capital. Unity allows workers to organize, to negotiate, to demand rights, and to reshape the social order. It gives them the strength to confront the systemic nature of their exploitation and to imagine alternatives grounded in collective ownership, equality, and democratic control of production. Class consciousness also provides workers with a vision of what transformation means. Without understanding the root causes of exploitation, demands become fragmented and reforms superficial. Workers may seek higher wages, better conditions, or temporary concessions, but without consciousness, they remain trapped within the logic of the very system that oppresses them. With consciousness, they begin to see that exploitation is not an accident, but an intrinsic feature of capitalism. They understand that true liberation requires more than reforms. It requires a fundamental restructuring of social relations. This clarity of purpose is what enables transformation to move from aspiration to possibility. Unity strengthens this vision by transforming scattered grievances into a coherent movement. When workers unite around shared goals, they create a force capable of challenging the institutions that reproduce inequality. They build organizations, unions, councils, and networks that allow them to coordinate their efforts, articulate their demands, and defend their victories. Unity turns individual struggles into collective action, and collective action becomes the catalyst for social change. The ruling class may resist, but the strength of the workers lies in their numbers, coordination, and role in production. Unity allows them to leverage the essential role they play in sustaining the entire economic system. The transformative power of class consciousness and unity extends beyond economic demands. It reshapes how workers understand themselves and their place in history. They move from passive observers to active participants, from isolated individuals to members of a collective force capable of reshaping society. This transformation of identity is as important as the transformation of material conditions. It is the moment when workers recognize that they are not simply victims of circumstances but agents of change, capable of building a world that reflects their needs, values, and aspirations. Class consciousness gives them the insight. Unity gives them the strength, and together they become the foundation for a movement that can alter the direction of history. Organized workers are the force capable of reshaping the future, because only through coordinated collective action can the working class transform the economic and social structures that determine their lives. Individually, a worker possesses strength only in the limited sphere of personal resistance, but when workers unify their efforts, they become a structural power that no ruling class can ignore. Organization turns scattered frustrations into a conscious movement, isolating neither individuals nor small groups, but mobilizing the full weight of the class whose labor sustains the entire system. In every historical moment where society has shifted toward greater justice, equality, or democracy, it has never been the benevolence of the elite, but the pressure and organization of workers that forced the transformation. Organization is the means by which workers overcome the deliberate fragmentation imposed by the capitalist system. Capitalism thrives by isolating workers from one another, by encouraging competition for wages, promotions, and survival, and by keeping the laboring class divided along lines of industry, ethnicity, gender, and nationality. In this fragmentation, the power of the worker is diminished, because the strength of labor is inherently collective. When workers organize in unions, committees, councils, or movements, they dissolve these artificial divisions and recognize their shared interests. They transform from a mass of individuals into a coordinated force capable of acting with purpose. This shift from disunity to organization changes the balance of power because the ruling class depends on the inability of workers to act together. Organized workers can reshape the future because they possess direct leverage over the functioning of society. The economy cannot operate without labor, and when workers move in unison, they control the rhythm of production, distribution, and service. They can slow down, accelerate, or halt processes that capital depends on. This is not a threat of destruction, but an expression of structural power. Organization allows workers to negotiate from a position of strength, compelling employers and governments to respond not to individual demands, but to a collective force that affects the system as a whole. When workers recognize that they hold this power, they begin to understand that their role in society extends far beyond obedience to economic necessity. They become active agents capable of shaping the future. Organization also deepens the political consciousness of workers. Through meetings, discussions, shared struggles, and collective decision-making, workers develop a clearer understanding of the structural forces that affect their lives. They begin to recognize patterns of exploitation, the mechanisms of inequality, and the interests of different classes. Organization becomes a space where workers analyze their conditions rather than endure them silently. This shared consciousness forms the intellectual foundation of transformation, because workers can articulate coherent demands, develop long-term strategies, and build institutions capable of sustaining their struggle. Organization turns awareness into action and action into sustained movement. The power of organization lies not only in its ability to challenge existing structures, but also in its capacity to create new ones. When workers coordinate their efforts, they develop forms of cooperation that reflect the society they seek to build, one based on solidarity, equality, and democratic participation. They practice decision-making processes that value collective input rather than hierarchical command. They share responsibilities and distribute roles according to ability rather than privilege. These practices serve as the embryonic forms of a future society, demonstrating that workers are capable not only of resisting exploitation but also of envisioning and constructing alternatives. Organization thus becomes both a weapon against injustice and a laboratory for a new social order. Organized workers reshape the future by making visible the indispensable role they play in sustaining society. The capitalist class derives its power from ownership, but ownership alone cannot operate factories, maintain infrastructure, or deliver essential services. When workers organize, they reveal that the functioning of society depends on their coordinated labor. This realization undermines the ideological illusion that elites possess inherent authority or that the economic system is guided by forces beyond human control. Organization exposes that society is built by people, and what people have built, people can transform. It gives workers the confidence to question the inevitability of existing conditions and to assert their right to determine the direction of social development. Furthermore, organized workers inspire future generations by demonstrating that collective struggle yields tangible results. Every victory, higher wages, improved conditions, expanded rights, social protections serves as a reminder that organization produces change. These victories accumulate, forming traditions of resistance and models for future action. In this way, organization becomes a historical force that extends beyond the present moment. It shapes the consciousness of those who come after, ensuring that the struggle for justice and equality continues with greater clarity and greater strength. Organized workers are capable of reshaping the future because they are the very foundation of production and the true authors of social life. When they unite, they transform their latent power into conscious force. They assert their collective will, challenge exploitative structures, and craft new forms of existence rooted in solidarity. Organization is the means through which workers move from necessity to freedom, from endurance to transformation, from being shaped by history to shaping it themselves. In the end, the truth that echoes through every struggle Every factory floor, every field, every crowded street, and every moment of resistance is this. History has never belonged to the few who claim to rule it, but to the workers whose hands, minds, and lives build the world piece by piece. The power that shapes the future has always lived in the millions who labor, the millions who endure, and the millions who rise. Capitalism hides this truth behind wealth, hierarchy, and the illusion of inevitability. Yet the foundations of society tremble the moment workers recognize their shared condition and unite. When workers awaken to their indispensable role, when they see that wealth is created through their effort and taken through exploitation, when they understand that their liberation requires collective consciousness, solidarity, and organization, then the world begins to shift. The future does not wait for permission from the elite. It is forged by the courage, clarity, and unity of those who refuse to remain divided and exploited. The working class holds in its collective hands not only the ability to challenge the injustices of the present, but the power to build a new society, one rooted in dignity, equality, and genuine freedom. The moment workers stand together with clear vision and unwavering purpose, they cease to be spectators of history and become its authors, shaping the path forward through their solidarity and their unbreakable will to transform the world.